Okay, so we are beginning Perek Yud Gimel, the 13th chapter. So now that we have explained exactly what is a tzaddik in Perek Yud, chapter 10, what is a rasha in chapter 11, and a Beinoni in chapter 12, we want to go back and discuss a couple of the questions that we had from the first Perek, from the first chapter now. And so that's what we're going to do in Perek Yud Gimel, and we're going to see one of the questions that it brings up right away from the beginning. If you remember, in the first chapter of Tanya, it said, right, that tzadikim yetzer tov shavtan, rishayim yetzer hara shavtan, and Benoni zeh v'zeh shavtan. We said, right, in English that means that tzadikim, their yetzer tov is shaftan, which we have to figure out exactly what that word means. Shafet means a judge. And rishayim yetzer hara, their yetzer hara is shaftan, and then a Benoni zeh v'zeh shaftan. So let's understand what we're talking about by reading inside. V'zeh says like this, Perek Yud Gimel, v'zeh yuvan, now we can understand the lashon, the language, maimer azal of the rabbis in Beinoni, with regards to a Beinoni. Zeh v'zeh shaftan, like we just mentioned. Peirush, what does it mean? Yetzer tov v'yetzer hara. So we have to understand, what does it mean, shaftan? Okay, so there are two words that could have been used in this context. It could be shaftan, or a shafet, which is what the words that it does choose to use, the Gemara does use. And the other possibility would be to be moishel. Moishel means to control. So what we're saying here is, unlike when when we think, at least most of us growing up in America, when we think of a judge, we think of, okay, here are the two lawyers, right? You have the defense attorney, you have the prosecutor, and then you have the judge, and he's like sitting there and with either a jury or without a jury. That's not really what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is we're using the language of shofet as though it was one of the lawyers. In other words, if you have a court, for example, of three judges, so you have one judge that goes one way, or one judge goes the second way, and then you could have a third judge, which is what we call machriya b'neihem, which means that he decides between the two. Or, to put it in a different manner, we have one lawyer that says this way, one lawyer that says that way, and we have the judge that is in between that decides, yes, we're going to go along this line and not along that line. Now, that is in contrast to if the Gemara would have said, zeh v'zeh moishlan. This one and this one control. Meaning what? When you have two lawyers, for example, they are going to express their opinions, but that is as far as it goes. In other words, none of them, neither the prosecutor or the defense, are necessarily listened to until we get to the climax of the case where the judge comes along and decides either for this side or for that side, right? But at no point of time in the middle of the case are either sides considered the winner. So that's what we're going to say here. Okay, so let's take a look inside. The Ksiv, it says in the pasuk in Tehillim, Ki yamod liyamin evyon, that he stands to the right of the poor person, right, lahoshia, to save him, mishayftei nafsho, from the one that judges his soul. Now, v'lo amru zeh v'zeh moishlim, like we just said. It doesn't say at any point that this one and this one control chas v'shalom, God forbid. Ki kishiyesh eze shlita v'memshala. Right, we used those words prior in chapter Yud Beis. If there would be any control, absolute control, from one side or the other, li yetzer hara, of the yetzer hara, be'ir katana, in the small city, namely the body, afilu lefi shah kala, even for a brief moment of time, so nikra rasha, ba'oisa shah, then he would be called a rasha in that point of time. So we know that that's not what we're talking about here by the Beinoni, because it can't be that way. Ella, instead, what are we talking about? Hayetzer hara eino rak al derech mashal kamo shayfet v'dayan. The yetzer hara is only like a judge or a dayan, right? Which we were talking about before when we were talking about if you had a court of three different judges and you have each one saying their opinion, or two different lawyers with a judge in the middle, like we said. Ha'omer daiso, he says his opinion b'mishpat in this court case. Right? V'afal pikein, and nevertheless, yochol lio shelo yeh psak halacha kach lemaaseh. Nevertheless, despite the fact that this judge is speaking in this way, and he's giving his opinion, and he thinks the psak should be like this, namely the decision should be in his manner. That being said, it doesn't mean anything. Because just because he has this opinion does not mean that we are going to follow suit. Yeah? Why? Because you have another judge on the other side who is arguing with him, who is stating the complete opposite opinion and saying why he's right. So at the end of the day, when you have one judge saying like this and one judge saying like that, we need someone in the middle that's going to be able to come along and be able to decide which one of the two sides are going to be the winning side. So that's what we're talking about here. So it says, at the end of the day, whoever the third side is, that is who the halacha is going to follow. So this is now what we're talking about. First, the Yetzer Hara comes along from his home, namely in the left side of my heart, right? And mehalev oila l'mayach, and he comes up from my heart into my brain, lehar herbo, in order to start thinking about all these things that he wants, that the Yetzer Hara has. Just like we talked about in the last chapter, whether we're talking about that he just wants to go after all the pleasures of this world, or he wants to think negatively about a person, or he has all different feelings, like we said at the end of Perek Yud Beis, about the feelings of jealousy or anger, or lack of patience for another person, right? All of these feelings are coming up from my heart and popping into my brain. At that moment, when they're in my brain, all of a sudden, here comes the defense, and right, here comes the Yetzer Tov, here comes the Nefesh Elokis, and he's going to come along, and now he's going to say his point of view. And he's going to come along, Shehu Nefesh Elokis, this is the Nefesh Elokis, Shebemayach, which is found in the brain. And it expresses itself then into the right side of the heart, right? Makom Mishkan Yetzer Tov, which is the place where the Yetzer Tov is dwelling. And then we have 2 points of view. So the Yetzer Hara is coming up with his whole shita and his whole point of view and his whole game plan, his whole, let's call it, agenda. The Nefesh Elokis realizes what's going on here in the Beinoni, and he says, wait a minute, that's not what we want to do. So he starts fighting from his side. And then what happens is the halacha goes according to the third side, Hu HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is Hashem. Hashem comes in, he is the third judge in this story. Ha'Oizro, who comes along to help him, L'Hayetzer Toiv, K'maymer Azal, like the rabbis teach us in the Gemara, Al Maleh HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Oizro, if it wasn't for Hashem coming along to help, Ein Yochol Loi, it would not be possible for the Yetzer Tov to win. So how does this help take place? What exactly happens? So Hashem infuses the Nefesh Elokis with light, so to speak, right? Now, remembering back in Perek Yud Beis, in Perek 12, we said a little bit of light pushes away a lot of darkness. So now that the Nefesh Elokis is fighting very hard, it comes in, it's attacking back the Nefesh Bahamias and telling him we're not going to follow that agenda, we're not going to go according to the way you're looking at things, right? So he comes in very strong, but the Nefesh Bahamias is also very strong. Along comes Hashem, he's the third judge here, and he's going to stand by the side, like we said in that chapter of Tehillim that we mentioned earlier, right? That what does it say in the chapter of Tehillim? Ki ya'amod liyamin ha'evyon, that he's standing on the right side of, so to speak, the poor person. That's Hashem that's coming along to help out by the Beinoni. That's what's going on here. Shemeir or Hashem al Nefesh Elokis, it shines the light of Hashem on the Nefesh Elokis. Lios la yisaron vishlita, in order that it should have this additional advantage and control. Now look at the words that he uses. Al hasichlis, on the foolishness. Remember we talked about that in chapter Yud Beis. About really what the Nefesh Bahamias wants to do is he wants to trick us. He wants to trick us to say, oh, I'm going to be so happy if I just go after this pleasure, or if I go after that pleasure. Or do you know that this person, the way he's doing this to me, he's so mean, and I should be so angry at him. How dare he do this to me? Doesn't he know who he's talking about? All those things that the Nefesh Bahamis, that the animal soul is constantly using as bait to try to mess me up in my brain, right? This is all the foolishness that's coming in. Hakasil of the fool. Etc., etc. Canal. And then the light will shine out over the darkness. Now, there's an obvious question in this. Now, what's the obvious question in this? Can you shut the door, please? Thank you. The obvious question in this is, we just said in Perek Yud Beis, in chapter 12, that Hamayech Shalit al Halev, that the brain is controlling the heart, right? It's ruling over the heart. Either, we said, by way of education, or by way of total control, right? That it just realizes that it's not going to win out and takes control and he stops it, right? Those are the two possibilities. If that is the case, right? If that is the case, so why do I need now Hashem to come along and help me win? In other words, we just said in chapter 12 that we automatically win. Yes, right? That's what we're saying, right? So how come now in Perek Yud Gimel, when we get to chapter 13, all of a sudden we say, oh, wait a minute, it's not enough the power of the Nefesh Elokis. The Nefesh Bahamis is so strong, and because the Nefesh Bahamis is so strong, it's a fight, and this side says this side says that. We need Hashem to come along from the top and to shine in more light, and then it's going to be able to win out over the Nefesh Bahamis. So Mashpiim explain the difference between the two. The difference between the 2 points are as follows. In chapter 12, if you remember where that point was brought, Mayech Shalit al Halev, it was brought as a discussion after the Beinoni had already davened. And if you remember over there, and you could take a look back on our video, which meant, I think we called it the auspicious moment, right? That the Beinoni, during the time of davening, his brain is in a state of Meichin de Gadlus. It's in a very expanded state of being. And therefore, everything is just shining from his head over his heart, and it's as though the Nefesh Bahamis is no place whatsoever, has no say whatsoever in anything. But then we talked about over there that after he finishes davening, what happens is that things start to cool down. And the Nefesh Bahamis comes back. And the words that we hear is Chayzer V'nir, right? He returns and he wakes up. And he all of a sudden starts coming up with these ideas. But what the Alter Rebbe talked about in Perek Yud Beis is that there is still a trace of the meditation that he had from the morning. Since there's that trace of the meditation that he had from the morning still in his brain, so therefore it has a tremendous amount of power to be able to control everything that's coming up from the heart, from the animal soul. That's not what we're talking about here in Perek Yud Gimel. In Perek Yud Gimel, we're talking about not when he had just davened, not when he had this trace of the meditation still in him, that is still giving him that extra power. Now we're talking about that he's on a regular footing. And the Nefesh Bahamis is very strong. The Nefesh Elokis is trying to fight off the Nefesh Bahamis. So in the case of the Beinoni, as we're going to see as we continue in this chapter, of course we know that at no point is he going to think, speak, or do the wrong thing. But at the same time, he doesn't necessarily have the power. So Hashem sees him, since he's putting all this effort in order to fight against the Nefesh Bahamis. Since he has that fight in him, so then Hashem comes along and he's going to help him. And he is then, that's what the pasuk means, that's what the sentence means in Tehillim, Ki Yamin, right? Ki Yamod Liyamin Evyon. That then Hashem sees the effort that the Beinoni is making, and he's ready to jump in to help out the Nefesh Elokis, to help out the godly soul inside of him, to be able to win out over the nefesh bahamis. And that's what we're looking for. So until next time, in which case we'll continue, Mitzvah Hashem, with our journey through the 13th chapter of Tanya.